Welcome to Journey at Home, where we create content to make it simple for you to follow Jesus and live a better life. If you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button for us so you don't miss any of this content. Now let's get rolling today. This is the second and final episode of this series, Next Generation Church. And we're going to look at one of the most shocking and disturbing stories about Jesus in all the New Testament. So Matthew, who was a friend of Jesus and he was there for this entire encounter, he tells us it happened just like this. He writes, leaving that place, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. Now, the place Jesus and his friends left was Capernaum. That's where Matthew was referring to. And Jesus and the disciples walk about 50 miles to this region that was called Tyre and Sidon. Now, here's what's significant about this area. It's in what's called present-day Lebanon, and it was a home of the Phoenicians, who were considered by Jews to be unclean and impure. Matter of fact, Jewish people in the first century referred to them as dogs. And I need to clarify, that was not a complimentary sports reference. This was a term of derision and scorn towards these Phoenicians. And one of them has the boldness to come to the home where Jesus is and ask him for help. Matthew tells us a Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to Jesus crying out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me." And then she tells the problem. She says, "My daughter is demon-possessed and suffering terribly." Now, we do not know what all was going on with her. And the idea of demon possession, it sounds weird to some people, but I don't want you to miss the main plot line. We can all relate to the emotion we would feel if we had a child who was suffering terribly. I mean, you'd do anything to help your child, wouldn't you? Which is why this woman is willing to face ridicule and rejection to come ask a Jewish rabbi to heal her non-Jewish daughter. So what would you think Jesus would do? Well, you'd expect him to help, right? He's Jesus. You wouldn't expect this. Matthew says Jesus did not answer a word. Seems pretty disrespectful and calloused. I mean, this woman is crying for help for her daughter, and Jesus says nothing. And we know he's healed hundreds of people. Why say nothing now? Well, the woman, she's not discouraged. She just keeps pleading for help, to the point that Matthew, who is one of the disciples there, as I told you, he tells us that Jesus' disciples, Matthew and Peter and James and John, all these guys, they come to him and they urge Jesus, "Would you please send her away? Because she keeps crying out after us. She's bothering us, Jesus. She's causing a scene. And we're not really interested in you healing her. We don't think she deserves it either. So we just want you to get rid of her. Would you do that, so we can have some peace and quiet around here?" And Jesus looks back at his friends and he says, "Well, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." Now, it sounds like he just said, "I only care about my own people. I only care about the Jewish people who don't know God. I only care about people like me who haven't experienced God's love. You can just let the rest of those folks go to hell," literally. When you read this, it seems pretty hard to defend Jesus after that, doesn't it? Well, this woman, she's there in the house. She overhears this whole conversation. And Matthew tells us when she hears it, the woman came and knelt before Jesus and started crying out, "Lord, help me." Now, this woman's humility is incredible. She's willing to endure ridicule, rejection, condescension. She's willing to do whatever it takes to humbly beg for help. See, love for a child will do that to you, won't it? Well, Jesus looks back at her and he says, "Hey, it's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." If we were there, I think we'd be like, "What is wrong with you, Jesus? I thought you were supposed to love everybody. This is awful." But the woman, she's just going to keep negotiating. She says, "Oh, yes, it is, Lord. But even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." And at that point, Jesus finally looks at her and says, "Woman, oh my goodness, you have such great faith. Your request is granted." And Matthew tells us her daughter was healed at that very moment. So what do you do with that story? I mean, from our 21st century point of view, Jesus sounds racist, sexist, and heartless. But I think from our point of view, we miss the real meaning of the story. See, Jesus wasn't trying to teach the woman a lesson. Jesus was trying to teach somebody else a lesson. He was trying to teach people who are a lot more like you and me a lesson. See, just before Jesus had left Capernaum for Tyre and Sidon, if we rewind a little bit, we find that he had had a conflict with the Jewish religious leaders. They had challenged him because his disciples weren't following all the Jewish customs, and Jesus had responded by telling them their customs didn't matter. For example, they had rule after rule about what foods were permissible to eat and which ones were unclean. And Jesus had looked at his disciples and said, oh, it doesn't matter what you eat. It's what comes out of your mouth, what you say that causes you problems with God, not what you put in it. Now that was heretical to these Jewish leaders. Jesus had just told his disciples, go ahead and ignore a key custom in the law because it doesn't matter anymore. But see, he was trying to teach the disciples that those old ways of thinking needed to change. And right after that is when he walks them 50 miles into an area full of non-Jewish people who his disciples, his friends, believed would make them unclean if they touched them, ate with them, or went into the same home as them. See, these people, they were worse than unclean foods. So when this quote-unquote unclean woman comes up asking Jesus to help her daughter, he's not being silent to be disrespectful to her. He's silent because he's waiting to see what his disciples are going to say and what they're going to do. He's waiting to see if they had learned the lesson he had just taught them in Capernaum. Would they let go of their customs that were comfortable, that were convenient, and instead would they invite Jesus to show mercy to a woman that they considered as worthless as a dog? Now, do you remember how they responded? They responded by saying, Jesus, send her away. She keeps crying out after us. So they hadn't learned a thing. They still thought they were better than this woman. They still believed God loved them more than all those other people. Their moral circle was so small that they thought only people like them fit in it. So when Jesus looks back and says, well, I was only sent to the lost sheep of Israel, he didn't say that because he believed it. He said it because they believed it. And he wanted to see if they would recognize just how small-minded it was. Meanwhile, this woman, you remember in the story, this woman's showing way more faith than the disciples. The irony of that, huh? She thinks Jesus cares about her enough to help, and so she keeps begging him to do it. And when he looks back at her and says it's not right to take children's bread and toss it to the dogs, what's interesting is he does not use the derogatory term for dog that Jews would have used to describe her. He actually changed the term. He used an affectionate term that meant a puppy or a pet. It was his way of saying, hey, I don't see you the way they see you. I love you. I care about you. You're valuable. And her trust in him is so great that she believes him. And so she responds with, kind of playing along with like, I'll just take whatever scraps you have for me then. And so Jesus heals the woman's daughter. I think much to the dismay and surprise of his disciples. And the irony of this entire story is that the woman who is supposedly on the outside of God's moral circle, she understood God better than Jesus' own disciples did. She could see beyond the customs and the comforts and the conveniences, and she recognized that Jesus accepted her just like she was. His closest friends simply couldn't, because they hadn't learned the lesson yet. So here's why I share this story with you. Let me ask you, which one are you more like? If you're more like the woman, you recognize Jesus accepts you not because of how good you are, but because of how good he is. His love for you is based on what he's done for you and not what you've done for him. Do you realize nobody can earn God's acceptance, which means everybody needs his grace? Are you more like the disciples? Are there people that you keep outside of your moral circle because you think you're better than them? Are there customs and comforts you're not willing to give up to reach out and help somebody who's far from God? Are there conveniences that you'd rather hold on to than join Jesus in loving people who are different than you? If we're honest, as Christians, and we're often far more like the disciples than the woman. We are content to be Christian consumers with a really small moral circle that only people like us and people we like get into. We're closed-minded, insider-focused people who don't care about those who believe differently than us or look differently than us or vote differently than us. But Jesus does not give us the option of following him and keeping our moral circle small. If you're going to follow him, you got to let go of customs and conveniences and comforts. And you got to make your circle as big as the world, because everybody matters to God. And everybody belongs in his family. Not just the people you like, and not just the people like you. Now, imagine if we could help the next generation see people the way Jesus does. Imagine if when kids are in elementary, middle, or high school, they started to learn that they were unconditionally loved by God. Imagine if as a college student or 20-something, they were convinced God accepted them and had a purpose for their lives. Imagine if they lived their lives with faith more like this woman and less like Jesus' disciples. See, I think if the next generation can experience that kind of love and grace in our church now, they will go change the world. See, Jesus, he walked 50 miles to change the life of one woman and her daughter. I want to ask you to do something. I want to ask you to widen your circle for the next generation, to change the lives of people who don't yet know how much God cares. If you will, God will use you to change more than one life. He'll use you to change the lives of maybe hundreds, possibly thousands, of kids and students and adults who learn to follow Jesus and who learn how much He cares about us.